button.
I have a big red banner that says we're live. So
Great.
I shall I kick us off? Okay, great. Welcome everyone to the first OpenJS Foundation Standards Group meeting for 2021. It's been a wonderful few weeks of respite between now and the last time we met. And today we're very excited to have some guests to talk to us about the Joint Development Foundation. Getting started though, just for our usual housekeeping bits, please put your name in the attendance area of our notes document, which we will pop in the chat just momentarily. And, you know, in terms of announcements, we're still early in the year, so we don't have too much yet. But we do have a couple. I wonder, since I'm doing the chairing, if Robin wants to share one of the biggest ones that came out yesterday.
Right, we announced the date and opening the CFPs, or call for speaking submissions for OpenJS World. It will be June 9th, virtual experience. And again, send your CFPs. I think it'll be open at about a month. So it'll get here, those deadlines will approach us sooner than we think. So.
Yeah, and then the other thing that we launched, I think between now and the last time we met, was the JS Landia Individual Supporter Program. So you can also check that out on our blog at openjsf.org. But this is an awesome way to deepen your involvement and support for our wonderful projects here, and also get some exclusive content info and offers just for individual supporters of the foundation for a pretty cheap annual price. So check that out as well. Miles is begging to be promoted to panelist.
Nope.
So
Nope.
somebody let in Miles. And then let me just check around. Any other announcements or possibly news from any of our other groups or affiliations? Emily?
Well, I think it makes, I don't know if it makes sense, but we have the board seat we're going to open up soon for election, the CPC primary director. So look for that soon.
Great, good, good thing to point out. Yeah, okay, well, I'm not hearing any other announcements.
I guess we could point out that the W3C tag election is closed and the person we nominated got a seat. So that's good.
Yeah,
Leah,
that
congratulations, is, Leah.
Leah and Teresa and
Sangwan.
Sangwan, that's right.
And Amy Guy is the other.
Great. I think that's also exciting because it's the first time, you know, that was a pretty full, wonderful slate of potential candidates to the group, and you know, a nice group of women who've been nominated to the tag. So I think that really brings a lot of balance to that group. So congrats to those, to the tag.
Yes.
I wonder if this has been discussed in this meeting before. Any thoughts of having like some of the representatives that this team has supported come to the CPC like quarterly or something, and with a what's up on the standards front for people who, you know, won't necessarily come every week but are quite interested in that kind of stuff?
I think that'd be an interesting idea. Maybe just doing some kind of quarterly just update or check in, and you know, Brian usually emails around about W3C stuff, but that's not always something people read. So I don't always read my emails, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, since we're supporting Leah, I mean, yeah, it seems like a courteous thing to have, you know, to actually sync up with her periodically. Yeah, yep. It makes sense to me.
Yep, and we're actually we have a blog planned with her, so we'll be interviewing her. So I'll just coordinate that on our end. I'll get her to the CPC and we'll get our blog
Perfect.
out, and yeah, we'll all get to know her a little bit more.
Yeah, that sounds good. Because yeah, it's important work, and it would be great to help those of us who maybe don't follow it as close as we'd like to do that.
Great.
Awesome. Well, if that's it for our announcements, I think I'll turn it over to Robin to introduce our guests for today.
Yeah, hey, super excited to have David Rudin and Seth Newberry here to talk about the Linux Foundation Joint Development Foundation and its new community spec program. Some of you may have been following it, some of you haven't, but they have, I believe, some slides to share and obviously lots of time for an interactive discussion. Jory and I are also following up from our strategic planning session we had to go to the projects. So this will really help sort of supplement that information that we take and bring our projects up to speed.
Great. Well,
without further ado.
Well, thanks for having us. So no slides. I was just going to talk. Seth and I will hopefully walk you through this. And I guess before we start, just as a baseline, I know we're talking to the standards group here, but just so I can figure out the best way to start, what should I start with, like the legal differences of standards and open source? Is that helpful or is that remedial?
I think this
I think
we
it's
have it covered. I mean, Miles, what do you think?
I was going to say that, like, we're broadcasting this. We don't know what everyone who's tuned in
Great.
Yeah,
knows
great idea,
and
yeah.
doesn't know, and this is like great documentation in the future as well.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So
Yeah, I'd
indulge me
say
for
yes, David, even though, I'm pretty familiar from working with you for all those years, but I think it would be useful to get a refresher.
Great. So, please indulge me for a few minutes. I'm just going to start really high level. We can dig into, any questions or details. But I think it's important to set the stage, especially for people who come from the open source world, because open source and standards have a lot in common, but there's some pretty significant differences as well, which leads to different structures and approaches that we tend to take. So, at the risk of being super high level, if you look at the history of open source, it really is a history of basically copyright and forking. And the idea is that you make your code available and people can fork it and change it, and that's okay. In fact, it's sometimes a really good thing. And so your licenses are designed to allow that activity. But the important thing from let's say a patent perspective is that because you're talking about implementations and very loose communities that can either be drive-by contributors or foundations like you have, they account for basically being able to come in, make a contribution, and potentially leave. And ultimately, if you have a patent issue with your open source code, because it deals with implementation, you have flexibility in basically designing around the patent, removing the offending area. But the code is more of a living thing. It changes and it adapts. The other important aspect is that open source is about the code, the implementation details. So from your licensing point of view also, your open source licenses generally only cover an individual contributor's own contributions. So if you think of all of your open source code base as just let's pretend a box, you have slices where each individual contributor has made a patent commitment to the slice that they themselves contributed, but not the work as a whole. That's a lot of times because you don't have control over the work of a whole. You don't know where it's going to go. It could be forked, it could be what have you, and you can't actually tell someone just because you made a contribution here that you're on the hook for whatever happens forever. Standards, on the other hand, comes from a different world. Standards comes from a world of patents and antitrust and also interoperability. Standards are there to define the interaction of components, but not the actual implementation details. And the idea is that we all get together, we make compromises, and for antitrust purposes, because we're deciding on a single way to do something together, by default, that's an antitrust violation. But under the law, they determine that this actually is pro-competitive, so you're allowed to do it. But in order to make sure that everything's fair, you have to have a level of due process to make sure that interested parties had a say in the standard, because standards tend to be long-lived and should enable lots of different purposes. So, the ultimate example in my mind is the power outlet in your house. In the United States, we have one standard. Different countries have different ones, but effectively, that standard says, here's what you can expect from the power outlet, but it doesn't define what you plug into it or what it works. It doesn't care if you plug in a computer or a ceiling fan. It just doesn't matter. And so, but we have to make sure that if I participate in the development of that power outlet, if I have a patent, even on something that I didn't contribute, all of a sudden, because we're all using those power outlets, it's almost impossible to change them once they're in production. I need to make commitments to the work as a whole from a patent perspective to make sure that no one can actually use a monopoly power to block other people. Because if I don't have any options and I have to use your patent, that patent holder can charge monopoly rates. So that's why in standards, we have a commitment to the whole, and that whole is based, and usually the term we'll use is reasonable and non-discriminatory terms. That can be with or without royalties. But the idea is that you can't basically use your monopoly power in the standard to basically hold people ransom or charge very high patent royalties for it. So I know I covered a whole bunch of stuff there. Any questions before I move on? Great.
Let me just contribute. Oh, go ahead.
Sure.
I was just going to ask, and maybe you'll get to this afterwards, but in the open source space, we have foundations as kind of a place for vendor neutral collaboration. And in the standards world, we see more SDO, standards organizations. And I would love to hear a bit of a take on kind of the differences in these organizations and like why one might go to one organization versus the other, and if maybe the line between them is blurring over time.
Yeah, the line is blurring in many cases. So let me be more of a traditionalist, because the gray areas gets larger and larger between the two. But I think the idea is that when you typically go to an open source style foundation, they tend to be more focused on specific code implementations, and they tend to have more, I don't want to say openness, because that's a loaded term. But what I would say is that there's less due process, and the idea is that the power to fork is the thing that tends to keep people together, and so you tend to have less formality in the rules, and you tend to have more open participation because you're not binding people to the work as a whole. The case of standards, because they come strictly from antitrust, there's formal due process and procedures to make sure that all relevant voices are heard, because forking isn't really an option. If I fork that power outlet, for example, it doesn't help anyone else because it doesn't change anything. So you tend to have more formality. Also, a difference that where standards and open source people tend to look at each other differently is that usually in standards bodies, the board or the steering committee has a lot of direct control over what happens and influence of setting direction and approving materials. Open source foundations tend to be more driven by the technical steering committee that sets the technical direction, where the board itself is more of dealing with marketing and promotion and trademark type of issues. So that's kind of at a high level what I see the distinctions to be.
I'd say there's also sort of I'm going to call it almost a social distinction between one and the other.
Yeah.
So oftentimes with an open source project, you're starting with a piece of code or a kernel. It says this does this, and then a community arrays itself around that piece of code and says, but if we do this, it's even cooler, and that all starts to happen. Oftentimes with a standard, you're actually trying to define something that doesn't exist. So you'll spend a lot of time figuring out, it's a quantum toaster, right? Does it float or does it fly? How do we make it work? And so that process by its nature is oftentimes a lot longer. And then when you get into really kind of patent intensive industries like telecom, right? Then you get an awful lot of process that kind of tends to give standards making or specification setting a kind of a bad name because it takes a long time and there's a lot of process involved and people can object and so forth. So so one of the interesting things about JDF and when you create, by the way, let me also define a term. There's a difference between a specification and a standard. So a standard tends to come from one of the national standards bodies, ANSI, and so forth. And those are usually mandatory in their most technical definitions. So they're mandatory. You know, if you're going to plug in a ceiling fan, it has to be implemented this way. Whereas a specification is an implementation, but it's voluntary. And some specifications ultimately migrate and become standards, but that's rare. And usually specifications are kind of specific to a point, and often you never see a standard, right? A standard is just, it's invisible. It's a protocol, it's transport, it's something baked in that nobody ever really sees very often. So, so that's one of the features about standards that is different from open source. So what David sort of originally went, you know, here's one of the interesting things: when you create a bespoke specification setting body or standards body, you wind up immediately getting the, let's call it 5 founding members together. And the first thing they do is they get their lawyers together to define patent terms, rules of process, governance, and all that sort of stuff. And it'll take you, I guarantee, never seen it go faster than this, 6 months. And you'll spend accumulated couple of hundred lawyer hours at minimum, usually more. And then the 6th guy comes along, signs the thing and says, okay, I'm in, right? And so David sort of said, hey, how do I get to the 6th guy without going through all the first part of it? And so JDF created a set of templates that sort of define the nature of governance and the nature of the working groups using just best practices, right? It's just, you know, everybody who looks at them is going to go, oh yeah, I recognize most of that. Although what is interesting is that when sort of non-standards lawyers look at it, they lose their minds because it's not like a contract. It's not, it's the JDF is intentionally very loose because we want the projects to be able to kind of define their own level that they need. So we've got a couple of projects. We've got one that is defining the metadata for patent information. Unfunded, these guys just set it up themselves. They're using the JDF documents and they're going great. We got another one, same thing, Uptain, which is doing a secure download to the automotive CAN bus. Doing great, right? They get no support from us and they're doing fine. They follow the rules, everybody's happy. And, you know, they've got something that is actually a real decent standard, and it happens very, very quickly compared to sort of the more traditional standards practices. So I think Jim Zemlin saw this, you know, what we were doing at JDF and said, wow, you know what, this has really got a high degree of fit for what Linux Foundation is doing. And that's when we merged with Linux Foundation, gosh, 2 years ago?
About 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, about 2 years ago. I think we announced it 2 years ago and it was official 1.5 years ago. So it's really been a very successful collaboration.
So yeah, and so let me kind of back up a little bit in that, you know, when you are going to create a standards body, there's or let's say you want to get together to do a standard, there's lots of ways to do it. One is, you know, you can go to an existing standards organization, you know, an ISO-IC, an OASIS, a W3C. I know many of you have experience with, you know, ECMA. But sometimes you want to have a collaboration that is, you know, a smaller consortium of select people. You want your own control, you want your own marketing. And in those cases, that's when you would go and set up your own collaboration. And those can be either a series of contracts between the parties, or you set up your whole new legal corporate infrastructure. Or then at the smaller level, it's just, you know, 2 or 3 companies can work together using, you know, more lightweight paper. But to Seth's point, that could take, you know, 6 months would be ambitious. And sometimes, you know, I've seen these things take much, much more. So what JDF comes is, it basically creates what we call a standards organization in the box, where we have preset materials that are non-negotiable, but they, rather than negotiate in a traditional setting, a where every comma goes, we have a series of options, and you can choose from those options like a menu at a restaurant. So you can choose your IP policy, you can choose your open source policy, you can choose membership levels, but basically it up levels where the discussion goes. And that now allows us to get basically standalone standards organizations up and running within as fast as days. Just once you get agreement between the parties, it's very quick. And the other thing we have is from a corporate perspective, right off the bat, when you sign the papers, you come under the JDF corporate umbrella. You're your own basically independent subsidiary, but you get to take advantage of the nonprofit status immediately, the corporate support and admin support that's available from the Linux Foundation. So effectively, you skip all that ramp up period and you start right with a standards body. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, it is an independent foundation. And so for something like OpenJS, effectively, if you were using this mechanism, you'd effectively be creating a sister organization that would have its own steering committee and its own structure, and there'd have to be some coordination between the two to make sure they coordinate, but it is a separate organization. Covered a lot there. Thoughts, questions?
One question I have is where do you see people crossing the line between, we get together as an open source project and we'll say, hey, we'll recommend this extra metadata. Please add this extra metadata to your modules. We're going to use it this way.
Right.
Not a standard, but we're trying to encourage everybody to follow that, right?
Right.
Versus actually becoming a formal standard. Where do you see people say, hey, I need to make it a standard, and why that versus just the more informal case?
Yeah, a lot of times it comes down to if you want independent implementations and you need consistency for it. So and the area is very gray, and we have, for instance, APIs in the Linux kernel that have been stable for years, and no one needs to go take it to a standards body because we all agree that that's what it is, and we're not changing them. But if you're going to add some metadata to, let's say, a particular code base, if you can add it into your own documentation systems, you might not need a quote unquote standards. But if you're looking for metadata that's going to travel between languages and approaches and not be OpenJS dependent, you might want to actually publish an independent standard so your C++ developers and your Ruby developers, etc., can all be using the same set of metadata in order to interoperate at some level.
One of the things that's interesting about this too, to your question, and this is a little bit orthogonal to it, but it's probably worth pointing out. But increasingly, what you see is all of these efforts that are coming together, particularly the standards efforts, really are data model oriented. Right? You're trying to figure out, okay, I've got a whole array of applications that I'm trying to use either over here in Salesforce or in somebody else's, and you want the data models to be interoperable. You want them to carry roughly the same information so that all these different applications can access them. So they're not really kind of classically a standard, but they fall into they benefit from the organization of standards. And so the community specification that we want to talk about and what we refer to as our latest release of these actually allows really simple projects around data models that kind of wasn't there before, but we sort of created a way of creating data model consortia very quickly in sort of our latest revision. So that's an interesting way of sort of touching on what you might have, which if you want, if you're adding metadata or you're adding fields or something like that, that you'd like to have become more sort of canonical, you could use a community specification approach underneath your existing entity and get a lot of what you want that might, I'd say, collaborate well with what you're doing in your normal open source activities.
Okay, so it's a flow where you basically can create specifications, but doesn't require that separate sort of sister org you mentioned.
Yeah, so let's jump into the community specification then. Okay. So for a standards body creation mode. The JDF is super lightweight and it's super fast to set up. But from an open source perspective, it still can be kind of big and unwieldy and slow. But the other thing is that we found, especially since we've joined the Linux Foundation, is that setting up a sister organization can be too much of a burden, but there's still a need to do specs. So if you think about JDF as a consortium in a box, we think of the community specification as a consortium in a repo, so to speak. So effectively, what one of the things you get also is when open source people come to standards, it's just a different set of norms and approaches, and it doesn't always make sense. And there's a bit of a learning curve and a lot of men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of approaches where these cultures are clashing and approaches are clashing. So what the community specification does is lays out a method where you can just set up a repo, and much like if you were setting up an open source repo where you put a license file in and some governance information, this is specifically designed for specification development. And I see that Seth had posted the link, but effectively what you do is you set up the repo, you copy the files, and what you have is kind of standards best practices, but grafted into a model that is specifically designed for repo-based development, including drive-by contributors. You can keep it private, you can make it public, but the idea is that you're making it really easy to start up, really, really easy to participate, but you're still using standards best practices around due process and antitrust. And if you start also stepping back and seeing these are various Lego blocks that go into the pieces, into the larger whole. So you can start off a project with a community spec. You can attach it to OpenJS and just be another repo like you have. And people can work in there using methods and tools that they're used to. But then if there's a time for it to become a real standard, if you think, oh, well, this thing's got more legs and needs some additional scrutiny or due process or its own foundation, you could actually then spin it over into a JDF project, and JDF is also built to accept community specification develop specs and has that mode as just a native operation mode now. And then to take it a step further, JDF, we didn't mention this before, actually has something called a PAS submitter status, which means you can do work in JDF and be a specification and then have a fast path to take it to ISO IEC JTC1 to become an international standard. And so what you basically get now is a path to start really small, experimental in a repo that can actually expand if you need to all the way to an international standard, should that ever be something that makes sense for you. But you don't have to go down that route, obviously.
SPDX and OpenChain. OpenChain has been accepted as an ISO standard, and SPDX is in the process and being balloted. It's a big spec, so we'll see, but it's due to be balloted sometime mid-March.
I had a few questions about where things kind of blur the line between
Sure.
open source and specification. So one thing that kind of comes up often is test suites. You can think of tests as kind of non-normative. Here's consequences of the specification, but they're usually maintained separately from the specification. And often they're not really they're not data bundles as such. They are kind of code. Is that kind of something that is that within the purview kind of how to arrange those? Is that within the purview of community specifications? And the other question I want to raise is there any kind of contractual work about things that have to happen outside a repo? So if somebody finds an architectural problem with a specification that probably affects all implementations, like a security problem, you might embargo things. You might say we need to bring a group of people from each of the member organizations into a group that is going to discuss this offline, how to address this across all the specifications. We don't want to make the nature of the vulnerability public until we have a story. So kind of obligations to participate in an embargo in particular ways. Is that also is that something that's within the purview? Thanks.
Absolutely. Sure. So let's start with test suites. Test suites are tough because they come in all shapes and sizes, and so I think, as you noted, they can be a gray area. In general, I would say a classic test suite, which basically says, give us your implementation and we're going to run the tests against it. And if you pass, you pass. If you fail, you fail. We'll let you know what. In general, I would not think those are a standard. And it's generally code, or it's just more of a best practice style document that you react to. However, sometimes test suites can have the effect of creating a standard. And what I mean by that is, if you've got 3 options in a spec on how to do something, and the test suite says you must do this, well, you're kind of setting a standard. Or sometimes test suites can add additional functionality. And maybe this isn't exactly what you're asking, but if you take certification entities, something like the Wi-Fi Alliance, they tend to build on top of existing standards, and they start off as a certification body, but they tend to start filling in the holes or adding things to a spec. In that case, they become much more standards-like and probably would be well served by a standards-like structure and licensing approach.
Yeah, and also test can, David mentioned this and alluded to it, but most of the specification setting bodies I'm aware of usually define interoperability tests so that implementers can understand whether or not they're conforming. Conformance tests, which are much more like a Wi-Fi, usually you get a label says Wi-Fi compliant or something like that. Number one, those are expensive, really, really expensive, because you've got to build harnesses, and then you've got to build the test harnesses such that they, keep up with the spec. And a lot of times what specification setting bodies will do is they'll work with somebody who does test as part of their business. But most of the time what we see is just basic interop tests. So it's essentially like a LAN party with a, where you're trying to do something to make sure that the spec actually works the way you think it does.
And then your question about basically confidentiality outside of a particular work stream. So both JDF and the community spec have approaches to deal with confidentiality. In the case of JDF, it takes kind of a middle of the road approach that says, there is nothing here that's confidential. That way you don't have to lock things in safes and be super careful with it. But it also says, we agree not to discuss things publicly unless the group has decided to announce things publicly. So in that case, you could have a security work stream in a JDF project that is not open to the public. The community specification deals with that a little bit differently, which is basically, it has confidentiality terms that are tied to the status of your repo. So if your repo is public, everything in there is public. If your repo is private, it's private until the group agrees to release it. So in the case of, let's say, doing a spec in the community, using the community approach, if you choose to have your main repo available to the public and you had a security issue, you could create a member-only security repo to have those discussions.
One of the other things too that's just a practical matter, again, if you're implementing a specification with a group that's an entity as opposed to a community spec, but I suppose you could do it even with a community spec. Oftentimes a specification, you want the specification to be distributed well within the ecosystem of the other people who are doing something similar, because usually one specification is a component of something larger. And so you do what are called liaison statements or liaison agreements with other organizations that might be doing something adjacent to or similar to what you're doing, so that you stay coordinated. So that way, if somebody's got something and they want you to add a field for a metadata field, they can issue you a request in sort of a formal fashion that you can then respond to, and then it becomes part of the spec. And then the other external organization can normatively reference what you're doing in the spec, and life is good. Sometimes, however, you'll find that other organizations are doing something in draft, and they want you to review it, say, hey, how does this fit within what you're doing in your ecosystem? But we're not ready to publish yet. So it is very useful to have some place where you can, either a members only site or something that is not entirely in the public view in specifications, that kind of doesn't exist in open source. So yeah, there's just a lot of kind of different shades of gray as to how you do what you do compared to an open source software project.
So we've covered a lot. I guess the question I have is, do either of these structures seem like it would be something that would be helpful for OpenJS?
So one of the questions that I was going to ask David and Seth is that, in our case at the OpenJS Foundation, we are actually a ecosystem of multiple open source projects, right? And so within our home, we have projects like Node, we have projects like jQuery, and then we have much smaller projects. And all of these communities have different needs, different experiences, different sort of understanding of, the way things should work, if you will. Right. So when we think about doing perhaps a community specification from an OpenJS Foundation project, right. Is it the case that we would want to be thinking about spinning up a sister organization for the Node community, for example, because that's a project that's a specification that's developing from that community, right. Or is this something that we want to try and tackle as a larger ecosystem community?
Yeah. Let me maybe give a slightly different reaction, and then I'll answer your question. Because one of the things that I think we find the potential issue we're trying to avoid is that groups, especially under Linux Foundation, start creating specs and put them under an open source license. They tend to put it under an MIT or an Apache license. And going back to what I originally was talking about from a legal structure, you don't get the legal coverage that you need to ensure that people can implement it safely. And it's one of those things that's not a problem until it's a problem. But we'd like to avoid it being a problem. So at the base level, what I'd like to see is all of the OpenJS projects using a spec license that's specifically designed for that, and procedures to make sure that people can safely use those specs. What we didn't talk about is things like, there's also the Open Web Foundation agreement, which is, one of the first community developed spec licenses. There aren't that many. So at a base level, I for an implementer's point of view, make sure you've got the right, your groups are having the right coverage for their specs. Then if you're talking about, okay, we've got a bunch of, projects under the OpenJS umbrella, what should we be telling them to do? I think at a base level, the community spec provides a very lightweight way to ease into the process. It uses tools and approaches that are understandable. They're easy to tack on. They don't require the separate administrative burden, boards and all the things that come with it. Basically, a foundation. Then I think the next step is there are projects that might graduate from the community specification approach that need more formality, that actually need their own identity. In those cases, then a JDF project could make a lot of sense. And there's lots of ways to slice and dice how you would set it up. I mean, you could technically set up an OpenJS foundation, OpenJS spec foundation under JDF, and have a bunch of individual working groups, one for each work stream that you have, one for each project. Or it could be that, for instance, that you could set the Node specification foundation, or put in your sub project there. And that a lot will depend on what you think it would work best for the community and what kind of leadership you think makes sense. There is something appealing in the simplicity of saying, if you want to go down the JDF route, saying, look, we just have the OpenJS spec foundation, and when you're going to do it, just bring your stuff here and we'll take care of all the rest. So there is some appeal there, but I think people are always the tough issue here, and so you have to understand your constituency. And if someone who's leading Node.js all of a sudden becomes a sub project of this other foundation, they might not appreciate it as much as having a seat on the steering committee at a specific Node specification foundation, so to speak. And I'm just pulling up random projects, but a lot of it's finding the right fit for the people and their goals.
I think just for the sake of completeness too, we've given you sort of the pantheon of approaches and projects that we've got at JDF, but there's actually one more. So one of the things that JDF does is we consciously limit the degrees of freedom within our document templates, because that's what allows us to scale. And it works. It's worked pretty well for us. But every so often somebody comes along and they've got to have something different. And At that point, what happens is you turn to Linux Foundation, and Linux can create a series within their LF series of something that's custom, but that works kind of like a JDF. So you can go from one extreme to the other within the family of Linux Foundation support products.
Michael Champion has their hand up. You're on mute, Michael. All right.
Joint Development Foundation.
Sorry?
Oh, there was a chat, and so what does JDF stand for?
Oh, okay.
Joint Development
Sorry.
Foundation.
All right, Michael. You're having trouble with your audio, just drop it in the chat. Your question or comment.
Do you recognize Mike Champion?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was was moving. Now I'm parked. Hopefully I have solid. Anyway, two questions, one legal and more or less political. The legal one is in W3C, the antitrust stuff is really rearing its ugly head. I wonder if you can advise us on whether, that would be a reason to take the foundation standards approach more seriously than we might have in the past. The other is kind of political, like with respect to the community process, whatever it's called. If there was some interest in developing something that was, say, marginally in W3C scope, marginally in what we G scope, and marginally in the the JavaScript Foundation's scope, would you advise? Can you advise us on when we would choose one path rather than another, or one venue rather than another? Thanks.
Sure. So as far as antitrust goes, that's one of the key things I think is really important to handle, because if you are locked out of the market because your technology doesn't get included or your interests aren't addressed by the standard, it can effectively put you out of business, and that's where antitrust comes into play, and that's why it's super important in standards. And you don't see it so much in open source because while it's an issue, you can generally fork. So both JDF and Community Spec deal with antitrust. They have antitrust provisions in there, and they also have provisions aligned to meet those organizations with U.S. government requirements for what it means to be a standards organization, which means you can take advantage of the standards protections and you can actually be recognized as a standards body. So that's really important, and I think anytime you're getting to specs where a group of competitors are agreeing on one way to do something, and that's going to be baked in for a long term, antitrust is really important, which is why I think it weighs in favor of using something like a JDF or a community spec rather than just the benevolent dictator for life model does not work for antitrust purposes in standards. So I think it's really important to recognize that. The other political question, how to pick a venue, that's always hard. It's more art than science, and every standards body at the end of the day is also a business, and they're going to try to sell their services and get you to come to them. Oftentimes, it's just finding the right fit. Different organizations are known for different things. But another thing to think about, and this is where both JDF and the community spec come into play, they're actually designed to be everything from a full-blown standards body that can create international specifications if you want, to basically being venues for pre-standardization. So oftentimes it's a good way to get together with a smaller group to test things out, and then figure out if it makes sense to take those materials to a formal standards body, a W3C or something else. And so in many ways, the JDF and community spec structures, while we have many projects that have been with us for many, many years, they're also designed to be disposable. So once you can do the work, you can move that work other places as it makes sense.
Yeah, we've actually done that with one of our projects, the Distributed Identity Foundation, where we've got a working group that's aligned with W3C, and we talked to the W3C lawyers, and they're all satisfied with it, such that at some point, when we're done, we can translate that through, I think it may be the W3C community standards group. I forget what they called it exactly. I think
Community groups.
Community groups. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe
we
incubation.
have so many communities in our ecosystem. So it does work, and it can work, but you take a little care in setting it up. You make sure that you pick the right licenses in the working groups, and then it works, or at least it can.
And actually, likewise, we currently have a JDF project that is doing incubation work for specs that will go into the Open Compute project as well. So it is designed to be able to move specs around.
I think my question might be a kind of follow-up to this one. There are certainly several small efforts I can think of. I shouldn't say small, because there are targeted efforts, I think, in our communities where groups of folks are kicking the tires on kind of that initial pass at, say, a community spec. And it's just a group of like-minded, smart developers who want to collaborate on something. And that work may happen without us knowing about it. Often does, right? Until some point at which they say, actually, we think there's a there. We're ready to mature it. But they've been perhaps already developing some work products, and they've kind of created some deliverables. Is there any concern, that we should be thinking about when we think about one of these truly community, created documents, bringing that, because we don't necessarily know the origin of the output?
So, a story that comes to mind is when OpenID was formed. So OpenID was basically, a identity spec that was developed by a bunch of, open web folks, in the back of bars and on napkins. And that was all fine until a bunch of big corporations decided they wanted to implement it. And then it took about a year to clean up the mess to make sure that all the proper rights were in place. And that was painful. It's something you want to avoid. One of the advantages of the community spec process is that it's designed to be self-healing, in that when you make a contribution, you're also making a commitment to the rest of the material in the spec on kind of a rolling basis. And you have abilities to opt out from a patent perspective, because we want to be very respectful of patents. But the idea is, if you have a group of people that are developing without any legal agreements in place, and then they just start working in the community spec model, it self-heals as far as making sure that the rights are cleared. You always have a problem, however, if someone makes especially a significant contribution and then disappears without any legal structure in place. And that's something that's really difficult to deal with. And it's a reason why you really want to avoid that situation, because that party can either hold the entire community hostage later, or unfortunately sometimes they'll exert undue influence in the formation of the formal group, which goes against kind of fairness and fair play.
And that's one of the features sort of that distinguishes standards from open source. And that is, your nightmare scenario is that something becomes important, widely distributed, common, it's embedded everywhere. And then somebody comes along with a provable standards essential patent that says, oh, I contributed this because I made a presentation to XYZ and I put my standards essential patent in there, and all of a sudden something shows up that looks an awful lot like my XYZ. So, and then they demand royalties. And so that's just, so the kind of the documentation requirements around a specification setting organization are higher. And I got to tell you, my colleagues and I, when we work on these projects, that's just that's just kind of our, that's the stone we try to push up the hill every day. And because anybody who's making a technical contribution should make the technical contribution under some sort of a contributor license agreement. And usually that's the membership agreement. The community spec sort of implies all of that within the nature of the community spec. But the ones that are kind of entity based, the overhead gets kind of high on that. And we're always trying to figure out ways to improve that. The community spec has a CLA bot in it that allows you to kind of ensure that people who are making pull requests are actually authorized to make pull requests. But so open source code, because it is code, right? You can read it like a book. And somebody adds a chapter to that book that all of a sudden you find out has got patent encumbrances on it. You just take the chapter out. But an idea can get shot through a specification. And so anytime you've got kind of the word must in anything you're dealing with in an implementation, it's probably turns into a spec. And so you want to take some care around that, depending on what you've got, right? If all you're doing is hacking away and experimenting with something, you don't need to worry about it too much. But if it starts to get serious, then you really want to watch those structures.
Because most of ours would probably start in a repo that's our default is, at least in say for Node, is an MIT license.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have some agreement under which the contributions are made. Now I know it doesn't have particularly strong patent protection or any potentially, but is it, I guess I wonder if does this say our default license should be something different? Not that we can necessarily do that, but would it suggest we should do something on that front?
Yeah, so for spec work, the MIT license doesn't have the advantage of covering the entire material, which means that you can have someone who makes one contribution and then asserts their patents against implementations of the spec that include other people's materials. And that's where the spec licenses, the source code licenses fail for specs. And so, while I think the community spec is a really, really good model, at minimum, I'd suggest using the Open Web Foundation agreements that are specifically designed for specs. The thing, I view the community specification as really a descendant of the Open Web Foundation agreement. One of the things we found with the Open Web Foundation agreements is while they're legally solid and they've been widely adopted, they do require some overhead to get people to sign up for the final spec as well. So you can still be left hanging, and they come with that administrative burden where, years of experience taught us to make it more automatic and not require that admin overhead, which is why, again, I'm going to push you to the community specification, but you should at least have something that's designed for specs.
I was more like sort of going off of Jory's question about, typically today we might have people start to collaborate in one of their existing repos. That's likely to be something like an MIT. And then you realize okay, this is something more sort of, is there anything we should be thinking about in terms of being best positioned to handle that case? Or is that about as good as the, best practice people achieve today?
Yeah. So what I'd say is if you have a team that is looking to do both code and spec, the community specification is again the way to go, because it includes the spec license and says, by the way, if there's code in here, it's under the source code license in the repository, and if nothing is specified, it's under MIT, just as that fallback.
How about the Apache license? Because, sorry, I'm just thinking on our collaboration spaces, I think in the end we recommended the Apache license as the default.
So again, for code, I have no problem with Apache. It's designed for it, includes an explicit patent grant. I think, in practice, the MIT and Apache serve basically the same purpose, but neither one is that applicable to spec. Because keep in mind, and maybe I didn't say this before, but the difference is that your code license is covering specific lines of code. Your spec license is covering independent implementations of the spec. And so if I have some code that's under an MIT license or some spec that's code-like under an MIT license, and someone else does an independent implementation of it, they get zero coverage. So if you're going to have everyone using the same code, then maybe the MIT license is okay. sometimes you decide we're going to have interop by just everyone using the same code. Then the source code license is probably fine. If you're talking about people independently implementing, then you'll want a spec license.
And also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, if I find myself having to, explain to somebody why one might want one kind of license over another, would it be accurate to say, for an open source project, you want to contribute like contribution, many one-time contributions and contributions from a large number of people, and so having it that the contributions are narrowly scoped. Any intellectual property you give relates to just the small bit you're changing. Whereas with the open source, with a specification license, you've got a smaller number of long-term contributors, and the scope is the entire project. I'm
not sure I'd say the number of contributors matter. I think it's more of how is it going to be implemented? How is the result going to be implemented? Open source works where we're all going to be collaborating on the same code base and using that particular code base, and forking is okay. A spec license is more intended for something that is going to have independent implementations and generally is something that you want to be stable for a long amount of time. So using my power outlet example, I want to make sure I can get a license to the entire power outlet, whoever makes it. I should be able to go to Home Depot and buy any brand, and it's just going to work, and I don't have to worry about it. No one licenses a little piece of the socket because I don't care about the little piece. I care about the thing as a whole. So I think it's really, to me, the main distinction is independent implementations.
Actually, though, the topic of scope is useful to touch on here because within a specifications, scoping the scope of work is important. Because oftentimes, if I do have a standards essential patent on something, but I'm making the contribution under a RANZ kind of license, that contribution applies to the scope of the specification. So, because what you don't want to have happen is if I'm Acme Corporation and I've got a standards essential patent that applies over a lot of stuff, and I'm giving a RANZ license to something in a narrow channel of endeavor, that does not mean that I'm giving my patent away to everybody for any kind of use. And so scoping is a important feature when you make a specification. And the other thing I think Michael mentioned about, you're doing some things in Node.js that, or in, I forgot where it was, but that he said it's starting to take shape as a specification. And what do we do to, should we just use the community spec? I think one of the good things to do too is if you create a community spec, start over and have everybody drop their contribution in as a new thing, because it gives you, it kind of washes it through the licensing filter. And so nobody says, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize I was granting this license for that, because we just transferred the whole body of work back into a specification effort. Just have them make the contribution new into the specification effort. I think it gives you a little more separation.
Thanks for explaining.
Don't know if we have any other questions. I know we are running out of time, so I appreciate everyone joining. As I mentioned, Jory and I are going on a bit of a project roadshow to kind of share information about the projects and standards. So I'd love it as we sort of learn more and bring it to this group and things start to take shape. Can we come back to you, Seth and David, and get some guidance, perhaps?
Yeah, we're standards geeks. We love this stuff. So
yeah, I mean, really.
I also know you're very busy, so I really appreciate it.
We're happy to help.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And thank you very much, David and Seth. This has been really interesting, and I am definitely excited to kind of learn more from our community about what they want to do, and then sort of triangulate that and see where we can and perhaps collaborate with them. with the JDF on community specs. So, but
That's
yeah,
great.
Rob points out it's 5 minutes over, so we should let people drop if they and probably pause the stream.